The room was silent, except for the measured clink of silver on porcelain. Outside, the city smelled faintly of coal smoke and damp stone. Inside, under the warm glare of chandeliers, men and women leaned over their plates, savouring courses prepared with a precision normally reserved for military campaigns. The soup arrived in perfect synchronization, as though its delivery had been rehearsed for weeks. Conversation was polite, even buoyant. What no one mentioned, not openly at least, was the list. It sat folded in the host's inner pocket, its edges creased from use. The names were in no particular order. Some had been crossed out, others underlined. To the untrained eye, it could have been a seating plan. To those in the know, it was the evening's true menu. Each toast carried the weight of a riddle. A general raised his glass to order, a factory magnate to prosperity. A minor official, perhaps overeager, proposed to efficiency, earning a round of dry smiles. It was all very civil, very correct. The kind of politeness that history remembers only when it realizes what came next. The absurdity lay in the details. The chef had been warned to avoid imported ingredients, not because of shortages, but because the wrong garnish might imply allegiance to the wrong side. A waiter, instructed to clear plates in a clockwise motion, did so with the solemnity of a man diffusing explosives. The wine, a deep red, was served as though its vintage alone could guarantee the stability of nations. By dessert, the atmosphere had shifted. The laughter was softer now, more brittle. A few guests glanced at the clock, others avoided looking anywhere but their plates. The host spoke briefly about changes ahead, words as bland as sponge cake, yet heavier than the lead crystal in which the final toast was poured. History rarely notes what was eaten that night. Accounts differ on whether the pastry was filled with cherries or plums, but it remembers the decisions, signed, sealed, and in some cases, swallowed, that left the dining room with the guests, clinging like the taste of something you can't quite wash away. It was, in the records, an ordinary evening, but the menu tells another story, one of absurd rituals, delicate manners, and choices plated with the precision of a surgeon's cut. A meal meant to be remembered, not for its flavour, but for the quiet, calculated ruin it set in motion. The winter wind clawed at the ramparts of Edinburgh Castle, its icy breath slipping through every crack in the thick stone. Inside, the great hall glowed with candlelight, though the flames sputtered under draughts, casting uneasy shadows along the damp walls. The scent of roasting venison clung heavily in the air, mingling with the sour tang of ale. It was a feast night, and in medieval Scotland, that meant both celebration and, occasionally, calculated murder. The long oak tables were set with trenchers of fresh bread, steaming bowls of pottage, and silver goblets brimming with mead. Servants moved briskly between benches, their shoes slapping against the worn flagstones. They kept their eyes down, partly in deference to noble etiquette, partly because in this hall, looking too closely at anyone could be a dangerous habit. At the head of the feast sat King James II, just 10 years old. The weight of the crown still too large for his head, and perhaps far too heavy for his conscience. His feet barely reached the rung of his chair, yet to his right sat Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor, whose political reach extended far beyond his arm's length. On the king's other side sat Sir Alexander Livingston of Callendar, equally ambitious, equally watchful. Together, these men ensured that the boy's crown stayed in place and under their control. The guests of honour that evening were William Douglas, the 6th Earl of Douglas, a youth of 16, and his younger brother, David. They were the heirs of the most powerful noble house in Scotland, the Black Douglases, whose lands and influence made them more formidable than some kingdoms. The invitation to dine with the king had been presented as an olive branch, a chance to mend frayed ties between crown and clan. Of course, in medieval politics, "let's grab dinner" often translated into "let's quietly arrange your demise" over appetizers. It was a tradition as old as diplomacy itself. Warm words, fine wine, and occasionally a noose waiting just outside the kitchen door. Still, the brothers arrived with the dignity of their station, cloaks dusted with snow from the bitter Edinburgh streets. Their armour had been left behind. After all, who needed steel at a peace dinner? Besides, etiquette demanded trust, or at least the performance of it. A Douglas walking into a royal feast in full plate would have been seen as an insult. A Douglas leaving a royal feast in chains would be seen, later that night, as a certainty. The hall hummed with the low chatter of lords and minor barons, the scraping of knives against wooden plates, and the faint strains of a harpist stationed in the corner. A fire roared in the great hearth, but the warmth seemed to stop just short of the high table, where conversation was as carefully measured as the wine being poured. Crichton spoke to the young king in hushed tones, his lips barely moving, while Livingston's eyes flicked constantly toward the Douglas brothers, as if studying a chessboard mid-game. The Douglas boys, for their part, smiled politely, drank cautiously, and accepted each course brought before them. Roasted fowl, honeyed turnips, salted fish. Each dish was served with elaborate ceremony. In another time, the same meal might have signalled genuine reconciliation. But in the Scotland of 1440, alliances were rarely sealed by food alone. They were sealed in blood, whether spilled in battle or spilled quietly in a courtyard at dawn. At one point, William Douglas raised his goblet toward the boy king in a toast. The gesture smooth, respectful, and likely rehearsed. The young monarch returned it with the awkward enthusiasm of someone both host and hostage, unsure whether to enjoy his own party. The courtiers clapped politely, the musicians swelled their tune, and the servants continued their silent circuit around the hall. Yet beneath the music and clinking goblets, there was an undercurrent of something colder. It was in the measured pace of the meal, in the way the Chancellor's eyes never left his guests, in the unspoken knowledge that no one in that hall could afford to be the first to leave, or the first to flinch. Every man at that table knew that in Scotland's courtly theatre, a feast could be the first act of a tragedy. Outside, snow continued to fall on the battlements, muffling the city below. Inside, the hall glowed with a deceptive warmth, like the inside of a lantern just before the flame gutters out. The evening was far from over, but for the Douglas brothers, the script had already been written. They just hadn't read the ending yet. The banquet had moved into its heart, the stage of any medieval feast where belts loosened, conversation swelled, and jugs of ale seemed to refill themselves by some unseen miracle. The air was heavy with the scent of roasted boar and venison, glazed with honey and herbs, their juices pooling in carved trenchers. Servants carried in great platters piled with roasted roots, steaming bread, and the occasional fish whose expression seemed as resigned as the guests who ate it. The Douglas brothers appeared at ease, their earlier stiffness replaced by the rhythm of the evening. William the elder laughed politely at a remark from one of the lesser lords at his side, while David busied himself with carving meat onto his plate. They were young, confident, and, most dangerously, used to being welcome wherever they went. The boy king watched them from his high seat. His goblet was refilled more often than he sipped from it, and occasionally his gaze darted toward Crichton, as though seeking approval for every word he spoke. The Chancellor's smile remained fixed, but it was the kind of smile that looked better suited to a funeral than a feast. Conversation flowed easily enough, but there was an odd weight to it. No one mentioned politics. No one mentioned the recent tensions between the Douglases and the Crown. No one mentioned the obvious fact that the two most powerful teenagers in Scotland were sitting under the careful watch of two men who would have preferred them anywhere else, alive or otherwise. The musicians played on, their tunes light and courtly, yet if one listened closely, there was a strange tension in their rhythm, as though they, too, were watching for some unseen cue. Their strings trembled not just from the pluck of fingers, but from the draught that crept in from the doorways. Then came the change. The side doors to the great hall opened, and in stepped a procession of servants carrying a large covered platter. Its size alone commanded attention. It took two men to hold it steady, their faces blank, their eyes fixed on the floor. The musicians faltered for a heartbeat before recovering, the slight pause almost unnoticeable to anyone not already expecting it. The platter was brought directly to the high table, set squarely before the king. The boy glanced toward Crichton again, as though to confirm what came next. Crichton gave the smallest nod, barely perceptible, and a servant stepped forward to lift the lid. Steam escaped first, curling into the candlelight. Then came the sight beneath it. The head of a black bull, eyes closed, lips curled back to reveal a fixed, toothy sneer. The animal's fur was slick from some final washing, and its horns gleamed faintly in the flickering light. It was not a dish, it was a declaration. In Scottish symbolism, the black bull was a herald of death, particularly for nobles. It was a warning that a man's time had come, as clear and unmistakable as a death sentence read aloud. If one wanted to convey doom in the most theatrical way possible without saying a word, this was it. Medieval etiquette manuals never covered this particular scenario, but if they had, the advice would have been short. Do not panic until the king stands up. A ripple of silence spread outward from the high table. The laughter and chatter at the lower benches faltered. Some guests glanced at one another with eyebrows raised. Others suddenly found their wine cups fascinating. Even for a court used to deadly politics, this was unsubtle. William Douglas froze, his hand halfway to his goblet. David's knife hovered above his plate, forgotten. Neither spoke. To react too quickly would be to admit they understood the message. To react too slowly might be mistaken for defiance. The correct etiquette for receiving a symbolic death threat over dinner was, unfortunately, something they had not been trained for. Dry humour aside, it was the medieval equivalent of being handed a "sorry you're dead" greeting card before dessert, only with horns, and in front of the entire political elite of Scotland. For some, it was a grim spectacle. For others, it was an unmissable piece of courtly theatre. The only applause missing was from the people who had orchestrated it. The boy king sat very still. His expression was unreadable, caught between childlike curiosity and the stony mask of a ruler. Crichton's face, however, carried the faintest curve of satisfaction, a man watching a plan move from theory to practice. The air in the hall seemed colder, the candle flames sharper, and somewhere beyond the walls, the wind howled like a creature that knew what was about to happen. The servants removed the bull's head after only a few moments, but the damage was done. The feast had shifted from warmth to chill, from hospitality to quiet menace. No one needed to announce what the symbol meant. It was already echoing through the minds of everyone present. The Douglases were no longer guests. They were prey. The bull's head had barely cleared the high table when the next act of the evening began. The side doors opened again, this time not to the measured tread of servants, but to the heavy march of armed guards. Chainmail clinked softly in the candlelight, and the sound cut across the hall like a blade through silk. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Knives hovered above plates, goblets paused halfway to lips. In the Scotland of 1440, guards entering a feast was rarely a sign that more wine was being served. The captain of the guard strode forward, his boots striking the flagstones with deliberate force. He did not look at the boy king, nor at Crichton, nor at Livingston. His eyes went straight to the Douglas brothers, as though reading from a script in which there was only one scene left to play. William Douglas rose halfway from his seat, the gesture part caution, part challenge. David remained seated, his hand still resting on the hilt of the table knife, a utensil far too small to matter, but instinct rarely listened to practicality. The guards closed in around them, forming a ring of steel that left no doubt about the evening's true purpose. The charges came next, spoken aloud in the kind of formal tone usually reserved for ceremonies or sermons. Treason against the crown. No evidence was produced. No witnesses were called. In the logic of the day, the accusation was the evidence. In another time, such a claim might have prompted a trial in Edinburgh's Parliament House, with lords and bishops debating guilt. Tonight, The trial took place in a side chamber off the Great Hall, lit by a single torch whose smoke curled against the damp ceiling. The Douglases were brought in under guard, seated opposite three men who already knew the verdict. The proceedings were swift, mercifully so, if one preferred efficiency over justice. The charges were repeated, the brothers denied them, and a judgment was rendered in the space of minutes. The Chancellor nodded once, a clerk scratched something onto parchment, and the torchlight flickered over two faces now condemned. Outside in the courtyard, the snow was falling in thick, wet flakes. Torches cast wavering halos of light on the stone, and the cold bit through even the thickest cloaks. The execution block had been prepared, its surface dusted white before being stained dark again. A small crowd had gathered, not the cheering mob of a public spectacle, but the hushed cluster of those who knew they were watching history, and perhaps their own future, play out. William Douglas was brought forward first. He walked with the bearing expected of his name, though the frost on his breath betrayed the pace of it. David followed, younger, slighter, his eyes darting once toward the high windows of the hall, as if expecting some last-minute reprieve. None came. The executioner, his face hidden beneath a hood, worked quickly. The sound was not the dramatic crash of steel striking oak, but the dull, wet thud of practiced precision. Snowflakes swirled in the air, and the torches sputtered as if trying to avert their own light from the scene. When it was done, the bodies were removed with the same efficiency as the bull's head earlier in the evening. No prayers were read, no bells tolled. The witnesses dispersed in silence, their cloaks pulled tight against the cold, their thoughts pulled tighter still against what they had seen. Inside, the great hall stood eerily quiet. The plates from the feast were still on the tables, the smell of roasted meat still hung in the air, and the boy king sat at his high seat, staring down the empty space where his guests had been. Whether his eyes held fear, relief, or confusion, no one could say. The servants returned to their work, clearing trenchers and empty goblets as if nothing had happened. In a sense, for them, nothing had. This was not the first time a meal in Edinburgh Castle had ended in execution, and it would not be the last. By morning, the tables would be reset, the floors scrubbed, and the court ready for whatever new theatre the next day might bring. Long before a bull's head landed on a royal dinner table, the Black Douglases had been building a position so dominant it made them both indispensable and intolerable to the Scottish crown. Their rise was not sudden. It was the slow, deliberate work of generations, stitched together through war, marriage, and the occasional opportunistic land grab conducted with the subtlety of a siege engine. The family's origins were respectable but unremarkable, minor nobility whose fortunes shifted dramatically during the wars of Scottish independence. In the chaos of those years, the Douglases fought with ferocity for the cause of Robert the Bruce. Loyalty in that era was not always rewarded, but in this case, it was. Vast tracts of land were granted to them, and with those lands came the wealth to raise armies that could rival the king's own. Over the following decades, the family mastered the delicate balance of feudal politics, marrying into other powerful clans, forging alliances when convenient, and breaking them when more convenient still. Their coat of arms, black with a silver heart, became a familiar sight on the battlefield and in the council chamber. In a realm where banners spoke louder than charters, the Douglas colours announced both prestige and the implicit warning that crossing them might be the last mistake one made. Their influence grew not only through force of arms but through calculated patronage. Castles were fortified, churches endowed, and vassals rewarded with lands and titles. This was the medieval equivalent of a well-run political machine, equal parts generosity and intimidation. By the early 15th century, the Black Douglases commanded loyalty from the borders to the Highlands, their word carrying the weight of law in territories that were Douglas in all but name. Yet the very traits that made them valuable to the crown also made them dangerous. Their armies were a crucial asset in Scotland's perpetual conflicts with England, but in peacetime, those same forces became a latent threat. Thousands of armed men loyal not to the king, but to the Earl of Douglas. Kingship, especially in Scotland, thrived on the appearance of control. The Douglases, without trying, made that appearance harder to maintain. At court, the family's representatives carried themselves as near equals to the monarch. They could afford to. Their wealth eclipsed that of many other nobles combined, and their connections ran deep into the network of Scottish aristocracy. Even in the competitive theatre of medieval flattery, it was difficult to disguise the fact that the Black Douglases were bowing to the king more out of custom than necessity. By the time William, the sixth Earl, inherited his title at the age of 16, the Douglas name had been synonymous with power for more than a century. He had behind him a lineage of military victories, political maneuvering, and territorial expansion that no other single clan could match. His youth did not diminish his symbolic weight. In fact, it made him more dangerous. A young earl had decades ahead of him to consolidate power further, and his guardians and allies could act in his name without waiting for him to come of age. To their rivals, this was an unacceptable equation. The Crichtons and the Livingstons, both deeply invested in controlling the young James II, saw the Douglases not as partners in governance but as an existential threat to their own influence. In their eyes, there was no balance of power to be struck, only a question of whether the Douglases would dismantle their faction or be dismantled themselves. It was not that the Crown and the Douglases were constantly at war. In fact, they had fought side by side in several campaigns. The danger lay in the possibility that the Douglas army, wealth, and influence could be turned inward, reshaping the political map of Scotland in their favour. And in a realm already fractured by clan rivalries, one family wielding that much control looked suspiciously like an alternative monarchy. Even the symbols associated with the Black Douglases carried weight. Their preference for black armour in battle gave them a fearsome, almost mythic presence. Chroniclers noted the unsettling image of entire cavalry units clad in dark plate, their banners snapping in the wind, a vision as much psychological as military. These were not men who fought anonymously. They fought as an extension of a family brand that every Scot recognised. By the early 442nd, the stage was set. The Douglases had the resources, the loyalty, and the reputation to shape Scotland's future on their own terms. All they lacked was an open confrontation to prove it, and that, their enemies decided, could never be allowed to happen. If the Douglases were to be stopped, it would have to be before William reached the age where his authority matched his inheritance. The solution, in the minds of their rivals, was not to challenge them in the field, but to invite them to dinner. After all, a direct attack might fail and make martyrs of them. A feast, however, offered the advantage of civility, at least until the main course. And so, centuries before the phrase Black Dinner entered Scottish folklore, the plan to end the Douglas ascendancy was already simmering quietly behind the stone walls of Edinburgh Castle. When James II inherited the Scottish crown in 1437, he was 6 years old enough to wear a coronation robe, too young to tie the belt himself. His father, James I, had just been assassinated in a violent conspiracy that unfolded in the most traditional of Scottish settings, a royal residence where no one was truly safe. The boy's early education, therefore, began not with letters or numbers, but with the unspoken lesson that power in Scotland could be claimed with steel as easily as with parchment. The murder of James I left not only a throne without an adult king, but a political vacuum so deep that every ambitious noble could see his own reflection in it. In such moments, medieval governance tended to default to its most dangerous form, a regency council. In theory, a regency meant experienced nobles guiding the realm until the monarch came of age. In practice, it meant experienced nobles guiding themselves toward as much land, gold, and influence as possible before the monarch could stop them. From the start, two factions emerged as the primary contenders for the boy king's custody, and by extension, for the custody of Scotland itself. On one side stood Sir William Crichton, the Lord Chancellor, a man with both legal authority and the fortress of Edinburgh Castle under his control. On the other was Sir Alexander Livingston of Calendar, who held the young king at Stirling Castle for a time and was equally adept at turning guardianship into political leverage. The arrangement between them was uneasy. Officially, Crichton and Livingston shared responsibility for the king's upbringing. Unofficially, each regarded the other's influence as a form of abduction with extra paperwork. At various points, James was moved between castles as if he were not a monarch but a particularly valuable chess piece, useful primarily for blocking the other side's strategy. In such a system, loyalty to the boy king was almost irrelevant. Loyalty to the regent who controlled access to him was what determined survival. Courtiers, who wished to secure favour, learned to adjust their allegiance quickly, like banners changing with the wind. Those who failed to adapt often found themselves without land, without influence, and occasionally without their heads. It did not help that Scotland in the mid-15th century was a land of fragile alliances. Clan rivalries, feuds over inheritance, and disputes over marriage contracts could ignite into full-scale conflicts with very little warning. The Regency did nothing to dampen these tensions. If anything, it magnified them, as each faction sought to draw lesser nobles into their orbit with promises of rewards once James came of age. The young king, for his part, was largely a spectator in his own reign. His public appearances were orchestrated to project stability, while his private life was stage-managed by men whose interests rarely aligned with one another, let alone with his. Whether James understood the full extent of his role as a political pawn is unclear, but children in medieval courts learned early that asking too many questions could be hazardous. One of the most valuable assets in this political struggle was the ability to neutralize threats before they became unstoppable. The Black Douglases fit this category perfectly. Their power base, military strength, and independent streak made them impossible to control through polite negotiation. In the regent's calculus, if James II was ever to rule without a Douglas shadow over his throne, the family's leadership would have to be removed, preferably while the king was too young to object effectively. This was not the first time Scottish history had seen a child monarch surrounded by ambitious guardians. Similar patterns had played out in earlier reigns, often ending with bloody purges of the nobility. In that sense, the events of 1440 were less an aberration and more a tradition, one of the few political customs in Scotland that both factions could agree on. The Regency also encouraged a kind of political theatre in which public gestures masked private intentions. Feasts, hunts, and ceremonial processions became venues for plotting as much as for celebration. It was entirely possible for a man to spend an afternoon exchanging toasts with his loyal allies and an evening drafting their arrest warrants. Medieval diplomacy prized this kind of duplicity. It was cheaper than war and, for those skilled at it, more satisfying. By 1440, the balance of power was delicate to the point of absurdity. Crichton and Livingston could not move openly against one another without risking civil war, but they could collaborate briefly against a common enemy. In the case of the Black Douglases, that collaboration took the form of an invitation to dinner, extended in the name of the boy king. Whether James understood that the letter was a summons or a sentence remains one of the enduring mysteries of his reign. In the end, the politics of a child monarchy boiled down to a simple, cynical truth. Whoever controlled the king controlled the realm, and whoever eliminated their rivals kept it. Everything else, the alliances, the ceremonies, the solemn oaths, was decoration on a structure held together by ambition and the occasional execution. And so the stage was set for the Black Dinner, not as an act of sudden treachery, but as the inevitable product of a system that made betrayal its most reliable currency. In 15th century Scotland, power was less a fixed structure and more a precarious scaffolding built from alliances, rivalries, and grudges. It swayed with every marriage contract, every treaty, and every unexpected sword drawn in the dark. The king was meant to be the keystone holding it all in place, but when that keystone was a 10-year-old boy, the weight shifted dangerously to the nobles who claimed to support him. The Black Douglases sat at the centre of this delicate construction. They commanded armies larger than some continental principalities, controlled territories that stretched across both lowlands and borders, and collected revenues that could finance campaigns without needing royal approval. To the crown, they were an indispensable shield in times of war. To rival nobles, they were a wall, blocking advancement, overshadowing influence, and casting a long shadow over the throne itself. The problem was not simply their size, it was their independence. The Douglases owed their power not to royal favour but to generations of self-reliance. They had fought for kings, yes, but they had also fought without them, and sometimes against them. This made them a dangerous variable in a political equation already full of unstable terms. Marriage alliances added another layer of complexity. Through careful unions, the Douglases linked themselves to other influential clans, creating a network of loyalties that extended well beyond their own lands. If the family chose to defy the crown, they could potentially bring half of Scotland into the conflict without firing a shot. The reverse was also true. An attack on the Douglases risked igniting a war that no regent wanted to fight. In this environment, feudal loyalty was as much a commodity as land or gold. A nobleman's allegiance could be bought with titles, secured with marriage, or, if neither was possible, neutralized with a dagger. The Douglases understood this game as well as anyone, which only deepened their rivals' paranoia. For Crichton and Livingston, the calculus was brutal but simple. If the Douglases reached full maturity under William's leadership, they would be impossible to contain. The young Earl's wealth, charisma, and political connections would allow him to play kingmaker or king challenger at will. Once that point was reached, the regent's influence over James II would be irrelevant. The crown, such as it was under a regency, also faced a strategic contradiction. The Douglases were too strong to be ignored, but too independent to be trusted. They were a vital military asset and a political liability in the same breath. Medieval Scotland had no formal mechanism for resolving such contradictions. More often than not, resolution came in the form of sudden arrests, fabricated charges, and executioners working overtime. The irony was that this approach carried its own risks. Eliminating the head of a powerful family could destabilize the very balance it was meant to protect. The Douglases had multiple branches, each with its own ambitions. Removing one leader could create a power vacuum that others scrambled to fill, sometimes with even more aggressive claimants. But in the moment, long-term stability rarely outweighed short-term advantage. There was also the matter of appearances. Direct military confrontation with the Douglases would have been costly, both in lives and in legitimacy. If the crown openly declared war on one of its most celebrated noble houses, it might encourage other clans to question their own loyalty. A public feast, on the other hand, allowed the appearance of reconciliation right up until the moment it wasn't. Crichton's maneuver, therefore, was not just a political strike, it was political theatre. The setting, the symbolism, the speed of the proceedings, all served to demonstrate that the crown, even under a child monarch, could still command obedience through fear. It was meant as a warning to every other noble. Loyalty was optional, but survival was conditional. In the strange logic of the time, this balance of power was maintained by periodically breaking it. The elimination of the Douglas heirs was less about immediate security and more about shaping the political landscape for the next decade. It was an act of pruning, a brutal trimming of a tree that threatened to overshadow the castle walls. Of course, pruning a tree does not stop it from growing back. The branches that remained after 1440 would soon test the limits of royal authority again. But in that moment, for Crichton, Livingston, and the boy king at their centre, the removal of William and David Douglas was proof that in Scotland's court politics, stability could be achieved with one decisive blow, provided one was willing to swing it at the dinner table. Winter in Scotland had a way of erasing the horizon. Low clouds pressed against the land, and the wind carried the damp chill of seawater far inland. In the early 14th century, this was the backdrop against which the wars of independence left their mark. Castles still stood where they had before, but many bore the scars of sieges. blackened stone, missing towers, and gates reinforced with mismatched timbers. The land itself seemed to remember the marching of armies. The nobility that emerged from those wars was a fractured collection of survivors. Some owed their survival to stubborn resistance against English incursions, others to well-timed surrenders and pragmatic shifts in allegiance. Victory had not created unity. It had created a patchwork of lords whose loyalty to the Scottish crown was conditional at best. Each clan guarded its own interests first, and those interests rarely aligned neatly with royal policy. At the start of the 15th century, no single family held a decisive grip over the realm. Power was distributed unevenly, like stones scattered across a board, each one a potential obstacle to the others. The Bruce dynasty, having secured the throne, faced a nobility accustomed to acting independently. While the king could summon his lords to war, he could not reliably dictate the terms on which they would fight, or whether they would appear at all. In this climate, titles were often more ceremonial than practical. A royal charter might grant a lord authority over vast lands, but whether that authority meant anything beyond his own walls depended on his ability to enforce it. Enforcement required men-at-arms, and men-at-arms required coin or loyalty, both of which were more readily supplied by kinship than by royal decree. In a sense, Scotland was less a kingdom than a loose coalition of fortified households. Smaller clans vied for influence through calculated feuds. Some disputes lasted decades, reigniting with every change in leadership. Border raids blurred the lines between warfare and tradition. A burning granary could be either a strategic act or a long-delayed gesture of familial disapproval. To the chroniclers of the time, such incidents were routine enough to merit only passing mention, unless they interrupted a coronation or a major feast. The crown, when it sought to intervene, often found itself forced into the role of mediator rather than master. Royal proclamations carried weight only if a sufficient number of nobles decided they were worth observing. A monarch could threaten excommunication through the church or the seizure of lands, but the actual enforcement of these threats still depended on other nobles, many of whom preferred to see their rivals remain troublesome. This unstable arrangement created opportunities for ambitious families. With enough land, a few fortresses, and the right marriage alliances, a clan could rise from relative obscurity to significant influence within a generation. The key was to expand without appearing to challenge the king directly, an art that required both patience and a willingness to exploit moments of crisis. In the early decades after the independence wars, several families attempted this ascent. Some succeeded briefly, only to be undone by internal divisions. Others overreached and found themselves isolated in the face of a united opposition. The lesson was clear. In Scotland's political climate, surviving was often more valuable than winning, and victories needed to be measured in decades rather than days. Amid this landscape, the seeds of the Douglas power were planted. At first, they were one clan among many, with holdings that were respectable but hardly dominant. Their early advantage lay not in unmatched wealth or military might, but in a pattern of aligning themselves with causes that allowed them to collect rewards without bearing the full cost of defeat. They became adept at emerging from conflicts slightly stronger than when they had entered. The irony was that this cautious strategy, which made them unthreatening in their early years, laid the groundwork for their later dominance. By avoiding reckless gambles, they preserved resources that could be deployed when circumstances were more favorable. It was less the stuff of heroic ballads and more the quiet arithmetic of survival, a form of political patience that many of their contemporaries lacked. The absence of a single dominant family in this era also meant there was no established template for how such dominance would be handled. The crown had no standing army capable of suppressing an overmighty subject without risking its own position. When one clan began to rise above the others, the usual remedy was to encourage another to rise in opposition. This created a cycle of rivalries that could be stirred or quieted as needed, a dangerous game when one of the players refused to be easily checked. By the early 15th century, the groundwork was set for such a challenge. Scotland was a realm accustomed to competing centres of power, but unprepared for one family to consolidate enough strength to overshadow the king himself. That moment had not yet arrived, but the pattern of feuds, alliances, and opportunism was already in place. When the Douglases began their rise, they did so on a stage perfectly prepared for the performance, one in which every actor believed they knew the rules, right up until someone rewrote the script. It was in this fractured, self-assured world, where no one clan imagined they could be displaced entirely, that the Douglases began to weave themselves into the heart of Scotland's politics. The balance that had once kept all powers in check would, in time, become the very thing that made their eventual supremacy possible. And once they reached that height, the mechanisms that had sustained them would become the same ones their enemies tried, too late, to dismantle. The relationship between the Scottish crown and its nobility in the early 15th century was less a partnership than a wary coexistence. Both sides understood the other's value, and both understood the other's potential for disruption. Kings needed their lords to raise armies, collect taxes, and enforce order in lands the monarch would never personally visit. Nobles needed the king to legitimize their titles, arbitrate disputes when it suited them, and, on occasion, lend the prestige of royal favour to their causes. It was, however, a relationship maintained through mutual calculation rather than mutual trust. A noble's loyalty could be counted on for the duration of a campaign, but rarely beyond it. If the king's cause ceased to benefit them, or worse, threatened their position, support could evaporate overnight. In this sense, medieval Scotland was a place where allegiance was written in sand, to be redrawn with every political tide. The monarchy's reach was also limited by geography. Much of Scotland was rugged, sparsely populated, and difficult to govern from a central seat of power. Royal messengers took days or weeks to reach distant territories, and their arrival did not guarantee obedience. A baron in the Highlands or the borders might treat royal decrees as polite suggestions, useful to cite when convenient, quietly ignored when not. In public ceremonies, the nobles performed deference with convincing skill. Fealty was sworn in great halls, hands placed between the kings as oaths were spoken. Yet behind these rituals lay an unspoken truth. Authority in Scotland was enforced as much by personal relationships as by law. A baron might obey the king out of genuine respect, fear of reprisal, or simple pragmatism, but not out of the abstract notion of national unity. Marriage alliances between royal and noble houses were one way to bind interests together, but they were a fragile tether. A widow's remarriage, a dispute over dowry lands, or the birth of a rival heir could unravel years of careful diplomacy. The crown had to continually renegotiate its ties to the great families, as though playing an endless game of keeping the most valuable pieces from turning against the board itself. Economics added another layer of tension. Royal coffers depended heavily on the same revenues that filled a noble's purse: rents, levies, and trade tolls. When the king demanded extraordinary taxation to fund a campaign or repay a debt, it was often the nobility who decided whether those taxes would actually be collected. Compliance could be slow, partial, or withheld entirely, each form of delay a subtle reminder of the limits of royal power. Occasionally, the crown attempted to assert its supremacy directly, confiscating estates, removing titles, or imprisoning a troublesome lord. Such actions were risky. A single miscalculation could turn a contained dispute into an open feud. When that happened, the king might find himself facing not one rebellious subject but a coalition of his peers, united less by ideology than by the shared instinct to defend their privileges. In quieter times, the monarchy worked through persuasion, patronage, and the careful distribution of honours. Knighthoods, court appointments, and lucrative trade rights were bestowed with the understanding that they could be withdrawn. This allowed the king to maintain a measure of influence, though it relied on constant vigilance. A gift today might create gratitude or resentment tomorrow. Foreign policy also shaped crown-noble relations. When Scotland allied with France against England, It was often the nobles who provided the men and resources for continental expeditions. Victory abroad could elevate a family's standing at home. Defeat could erode their fortunes and patience with royal leadership. The king might bear the title of commander, but the nobles bore the cost in both coin and kin. This uneasy arrangement bred a peculiar etiquette. Disputes between the crown and a powerful family were rarely framed as outright defiance. Instead, grievances were couched in legal arguments, lineage claims, or the need to uphold ancient rights. These layers of formality masked the raw competition for influence, allowing both sides to step back from the brink when necessary without public humiliation. The irony was that this same etiquette, meant to preserve stability, also prolonged conflicts. A feud conducted through petitions and counter-petitions could last years, with neither side willing to deliver a decisive blow that might end it, unless, of course, a sudden opportunity arose that could be disguised as something else entirely. By the early reign of James II, this pattern of cautious cooperation and occasional confrontation had become second nature. Nobles accepted the monarchy's symbolic primacy, and the monarchy accepted the nobles' practical autonomy. It was an arrangement that seemed sustainable, until one family learned how to tip the balance so far in its favor that the old rules no longer applied. That family's name would soon dominate the court, the council, and the battlefield: Douglas. The transformation of the Douglas family from one clan among many to the most formidable power in Scotland was not the result of a single stroke of fortune, but a series of carefully timed moves spanning generations. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, they mastered the art of turning opportunity into permanence, ensuring that each gain, whether in land, title, or influence, became a stepping stone to the next. Their earliest ascent was tied to military service. The Douglases fought in the wars of independence not merely as participants, but as commanders who delivered victories when they mattered most. At a time when the monarchy relied heavily on noble-led forces, such service did more than win battles. It won favor, titles, and a reputation for reliability that would long outlast the war itself. Marriage alliances multiplied these advantages. The Douglases pursued unions not for romance, but for geography and inheritance. By wedding into families whose lands bordered their own, they knit together territories into continuous, defensible blocks. Each marriage brought new castles, new vassals, and new political leverage. In the ledger of noble ambition, these alliances were worth more than gold. Land acquisition was not always peaceful. Feuds, forfeitures, and opportunistic claims during times of royal instability allowed the Douglases to absorb holdings from weakened neighbours. When rivals fell afoul of the crown, the Douglases were often in position to assist in the redistribution of their estates. Such assistance was rarely refused, and even more rarely reversed. By the early 1402, the family had accumulated a web of estates stretching from the borders to the lowlands. This was more than prestige property. It provided resources: rents from prosperous tenants, grazing lands for cavalry horses, and strategic positions controlling key trade routes. A Douglas army could be raised and supplied without appealing to the crown, a fact not lost on either side. Symbols mattered as much as substance. The Douglas coat of arms, silver stars on a blue field, was already known across Scotland, but their preference for black armour in the field added a layer of deliberate intimidation. Chroniclers noted the imposing sight of Douglas retainers riding beneath black banners, a visual reminder that their presence was both a promise and a threat. In court, they moved with equal skill. The Douglases cultivated a reputation for loyalty to the monarchy, attending councils, sponsoring royal events, and participating in high-profile tournaments. Publicly, they framed their growing power as service to the realm. Privately, they ensured that every royal favour received came with a corresponding increase in their independence. The Crown, at least initially, tolerated this expansion. A strong Douglas presence on the borders deterred English incursions, and their resources could be tapped during continental campaigns in support of France. As long as the Douglases remained outwardly cooperative, their growing strength was an asset rather than a challenge. But the balance was shifting. By mid-century, the Douglases commanded forces larger than those of many European principalities. They held earldoms, lordships, and castles that could rival the resources of the king himself. Their alliances reached into nearly every influential family in Scotland, giving them a voice in decisions made far from their own halls. With power came a change in perception. The Douglases were no longer just respected allies, they were envied and feared. Smaller clans began to look to them for protection, sometimes bypassing the crown entirely. Disputes that might once have been taken to Edinburgh were now quietly resolved in Douglas halls, often in the family's favour. This quiet usurpation of royal prerogative did not go unnoticed. Rival factions within the court, particularly those surrounding Sir William Crichton and Sir Alexander Livingston, began to view the Douglases not as a pillar of stability, but as a wall blocking their own ambitions. The stronger the family became, the more their every action was scrutinised for signs of overreach. By the time William Douglas, 6th Earl of Douglas, inherited the title at 16, the family was less a noble house in the traditional sense and more a parallel power structure. They had the lands, the armies, the alliances, and the reputation to challenge the crown if they chose. And in a Scotland where the monarch was a boy and the regency was divided, it was only a matter of time before someone decided that the safest way to deal with such a house was to remove its head, preferably in a way that sent a message to everyone else in the room. Snow was still settling over Edinburgh when word began to spread. The night's music and conversation were replaced by the slow creak of gates and the muffled clatter of departing horses. Inside the castle, servants moved quietly, gathering trenchers, scraping plates, and avoiding the courtyard where the last embers of torchlight still glowed. The Douglases were gone, but the chill they left behind lingered longer than the winter air. News travelled faster than the riders who carried it. By dawn, whispers had reached the city below. The Earl and his brother had been executed. The official reason was treason, the proof never quite explained. The trial conveniently swift. For some, it was confirmation that the crown, or those speaking in its name, was capable of decisive action. For others, it was a sign that no invitation was truly safe. In the borders, the reaction was less polite. Douglas retainers, upon hearing the fate of their young lord, did not wait for royal envoys to provide context. Strongholds were fortified, garrisons reinforced, and messages sent to allied clans. The display at Edinburgh might have removed 2 heads, but it had not severed the body of the family. The Black Douglases still had cousins, uncles, and vassals with both the will and the means to retaliate. Yet retaliation was not immediate. The surviving branches of the family understood the lesson embedded in the feast. Direct confrontation could invite the same fate. Instead, their resistance took quieter forms: delayed payments, unfulfilled levies, and disputes brought to local courts instead of royal ones. It was the sort of opposition that left no single point to strike, yet slowly eroded central authority. In Edinburgh, Sir William Crichton and his allies moved quickly to secure the advantage. Royal proclamations announced the justice of the executions, framing them as necessary to protect the realm from rebellion. Lands and incomes attached to the late Earl's titles were placed under Crown administration, officially temporary, though in practice a convenient redistribution to loyalists. The political theatre was almost as elaborate as the dinner that had preceded it. The Livingstons, rivals to the Crichtons, were notably absent from the celebrations. They had not been involved in the planning of the feast, and their silence afterward was deliberate. By allowing Crichton to bear sole responsibility for the act, they avoided the risk of Douglas vengeance while keeping the door open to future alliances. In the game of Regency politics, neutrality was often just another form of positioning. For the young king, the immediate benefit was ambiguous. If James II had been a pawn, he was now a pawn in fewer hands. If he had been a participant, The move had strengthened his authority only in the sense that fewer people now questioned his capacity for ruthlessness. Either way, the removal of the Douglas brothers shifted the balance of power, though not entirely in favour of the crown. Outside the capital, the executions had a chilling effect on the broader nobility. Banquets were held with more subdued company. Invitations from the court were weighed as carefully as summons from an enemy. The symbolism of the black bull's head was not lost on anyone. It had been meant as a message, and it had been received. Yet symbols, once loosed into the world, often acquired lives of their own, and in the hands of the Douglases' sympathizers, it became a banner of grievance. Border conflicts, never entirely dormant, began to flare with new intensity. Cattle raids, skirmishes and ambushes increased, particularly against those seen as Crichton allies. Each act could be dismissed as an isolated feud, but together they formed a pattern. The dinner had not ended the instability, only shifted its form. The Regency's resources were stretched thin, trying to suppress a dozen small fires instead of one great blaze. Merchants and burghers felt the change as well. Trade routes through Douglas-held territories became less reliable, tolls increased, and caravans required heavier guards. Commerce, like politics, had little patience for uncertainty, and some towns began to negotiate directly with local lords for safe passage, sidestepping the crown entirely. In doing so, they reinforced the very independence the feast had been intended to curtail. Within months, the court found itself caught in a contradiction. The removal of the Douglas heirs had been framed as an assertion of royal strength, yet the aftershocks revealed the fragility of that strength. Each faction in Edinburgh read the event differently, a warning, a provocation, or an opportunity. What none of them read it as was the conclusion to a problem. The winter of 1440 closed over Scotland with the air of a country holding its breath. The Douglases had been wounded, not destroyed. The crown had acted, but not decisively enough to settle the matter. In the distance, along the border hills, in lowland castles, and in the guarded speech of noble halls, the echo of the black dinner lingered, waiting for the next move. The figure of James II at the time of the black dinner is difficult to pin down. Contemporaries saw him as both central and peripheral to the event. The boy at the head of the table, yet not necessarily the one arranging the seating. He was 10 years old enough to understand the symbolism of a black bull's head, perhaps too young to grasp the full calculus of its presentation. The image of him presiding over the feast would endure, whether or not he had ordered it. In the months following, accounts began to diverge. Some chroniclers placed him firmly in the role of an innocent witness, a monarch forced to watch as his advisors acted in the realm's interest. Others, often writing in the pay of rival factions, hinted that he had given tacit approval, or at least did nothing to intervene. In a court that valued appearances as much as reality, neither version was entirely safe for the boy king. The Crichton faction had every reason to present James as a ruler willing to sanction necessary ruthlessness. It lent legitimacy to their actions, and suggested that the authority came not from them, but from the throne itself. Public proclamations spoke of the king's steadfast resolve in the face of treason, carefully omitting how that resolve had been demonstrated while seated beside the Lord Chancellor. The reality that a child had been surrounded by men with far more experience in both politics and intimidation was left unmentioned. For the Livingstons, the episode was an opportunity to portray James as a captive monarch in need of their guidance. They whispered that the boy had been manipulated, that his youth had been exploited, and that only a change in guardianship could protect him from further misuse. These arguments were not purely altruistic. The Regency was a prize, and control over the king meant control over the kingdom's levers of power. In their telling, the Black Dinner was not evidence of royal strength, but of its absence. Among the broader nobility, the king's reputation became a matter of cautious interpretation. Some believed he was already being groomed into a ruler who would brook no rivals, a dangerous prospect for magnates accustomed to a pliable monarchy. Others saw him as a blank slate upon which competing factions were trying to write their agendas. In either case, his youth made him unpredictable, a factor that could inspire either loyalty or preemptive opposition. Outside the halls of power, the common people received only fragments of the story. Royal messengers spread the official version, emphasizing the suppression of treason and the restoration of order. Ballads and fireside tales, however, often recast the boy king as a figure trapped between wolves, sometimes frightened, sometimes complicit, depending on the singer's loyalties. In this way, James II became as much a character in legend as a figure in history. Over time, the memory of the feast began to shape expectations of the king's adult rule. If he had been a pawn then, many assumed he would work to ensure he was never one again. If he had been a willing participant, the implication was that his reign would be marked by similar acts of calculated removal. Both interpretations gave weight to the idea that the Black Dinner was not merely an episode, but a prelude. The young king himself offered little public clarity. He continued to attend councils flanked by his senior advisors, his expressions carefully neutral. He did not publicly denounce the executions, nor did he boast of them. In a court where a misplaced word could become a weapon, silence was often the safest form of speech. Yet silence can be read as consent as easily as dissent. As years passed, the line between what James had chosen and what had been chosen for him blurred. His eventual assertiveness as an adult ruler, particularly in matters concerning overmighty subjects, would be traced by some back to that winter night in 1440. Whether they were right or wrong mattered less than the persistence of the association. In foreign courts, the story was received with the same mix of caution and curiosity. A monarch who could, or would, dispatch great nobles at the age of 10 was either dangerously capable or dangerously controlled. Ambassadors reported home in measured tones, noting that Scotland's throne might be young, but its shadow was long. It was a reputation that could serve as both deterrent and invitation. By the time James II reached maturity, the events of the Black Dinner had fused with his public image. To his supporters, it was proof that he had been tempered early in the realities of kingship. To his detractors, it was the mark of a ruler formed in the crucible of factional cruelty. Either way, the boy who had once been seated at a dangerous table would grow into a man who understood the uses and the costs of such gatherings. The Black Dinner did not remain confined to the records of scribes and the guarded accounts of courtiers. Over the decades, it slipped into the realm of story, reshaped each time it was told. What had been a calculated act of political elimination became, in memory, a drama of betrayal played out under the glow of torches. Fact and embellishment were served together, each lending flavour to the other. The Black Bull's head was the first detail to take on a life of its own. Chroniclers treated it as proof of deliberate theatre, a symbol of noble doom understood instantly by all in attendance. In popular retellings, the moment of its unveiling grew more elaborate. Some claimed it was still warm, others that it was accompanied by a silent nod from the king. Reality mattered less than the image, and the image was unshakable. Songs and ballads carried the tale beyond Scotland's borders. In some, the Douglases were wronged heroes, betrayed under the guise of hospitality. In others, they were dangerous upstarts, brought low by royal justice. Both versions found audiences, depending on whether the singer sought to praise the throne or warn against its excesses. Listeners rarely asked which was closer to truth. Within Scotland, the story became a cautionary proverb. Invitations to dine at another lord's table were sometimes met with the half-jest, "No bulls, I trust?" The phrase was delivered with a smile, but it carried a reminder. In certain halls, the meal was not the only thing to be consumed. The Black Dinner joined a long tradition of weaponized hospitality, standing alongside older tales in which bread and salt were no guarantee of safety. Historians of later centuries, poring over the event, noted how quickly the specifics had blurred. Some accounts placed the feast in different seasons, others gave different names to the key players. Even the age of the king varied depending on the source. What remained constant was the core narrative. youth, treachery, and a public death framed as justice. This persistence ensured that the Black Dinner outlived the political struggle that had produced it. By the time the Douglases' power finally waned in the later 15th century, the feast had become part of the family's enduring identity. As much as their coat of arms or their black armor, supporters cited it as evidence of their victimhood, detractors as proof of the dangers they once posed. It was a story that could be wielded by either side. The irony was that the dinner had not achieved its intended finality. It had been meant to end a threat, to demonstrate that no subject was beyond the reach of the crown. Instead, it had created a symbol too potent to fade, one that continued to inspire resistance, rumor, and romanticize defiance. Symbols, once set loose, are rarely obedient to their makers. Centuries later, writers and dramatists would rediscover the tale. They would strip away the names, shift the setting, and retain the essential architecture. A gathering, a gesture of reconciliation, and the sudden turn to blood. Audiences far removed from medieval Scotland would still recognize the tension in that sequence. Hospitality betrayed is a theme that requires no translation. The Black Dinner also lingered in local folklore, woven into ghost stories of Edinburgh Castle. Visitors were told of spectral drums in the night, of footsteps in the great hall when it stood empty, of shadows that paused as though awaiting a signal. None of these details appear in the official record, but they persisted because they fit the atmosphere the event had left behind. Even in modern retellings, the historical accuracy of the Black Dinner is often secondary to its mood. It is a story that thrives on the moment before the betrayal, the sense that the air in the hall has shifted, that every laugh has become a little too careful. The facts may be debated, but the feeling is fixed. It is the same feeling that must have settled over the guests in 1440, when the platter was placed before the Douglases and the lid was slowly lifted. And so the feast continues, not in the kitchens of Edinburgh Castle, but in the imagination. It endures because it offers both a warning and a performance, a reminder that in politics, the table is never just a place to eat. Some courses are meant to be consumed, others are meant to consume you. The great hall of Edinburgh Castle stands quiet now. Stone walls that once caught the light of torches are grey in the thin daylight, their shadows long and cold. The trestle tables are bare, the air still faintly smelling of smoke and damp wood. Somewhere, the echo of music seems possible, but it is only the wind passing through narrow windows. It is easy to picture the scene as it was that winter night in 1440. The firelight, the banners, the polished cups of ale, the easy murmur of conversation, until the footsteps in the corridor, a platter set down with deliberate care, the lid lifted, the moment stretching just a little too long. In that moment, a feast turned into a verdict. The Douglases' fate had been decided long before they stepped into the castle, but the theatre of the dinner ensured it would be remembered. It was not the execution in the courtyard that entered legend. It was the moment the bull's head stared back at them from the table. In medieval Scotland, symbols could kill as effectively as swords. The Black Dinner was meant to resolve a problem. Instead, it became part of Scotland's political language. It was retold, reshaped, and repurposed until it was as much a parable as a historical event. A warning about power, about hospitality, about the distance between a guest and a prisoner. And like all good warnings, it survived precisely because it was never fully resolved. Centuries have passed, and the castle's stones have outlasted the ambitions that once filled its halls. But the story remains, drifting through archives and firesides alike. It endures not because of the number of lives it claimed, but because of the way it was served, calculated, symbolic, and in full view of the court. The taste of betrayal, it seems, is a flavour history does not forget. In a world where allegiances could shift with a nod, and oaths could be broken between one course and the next, the Black Dinner stands as a reminder. A meal could be an alliance, a test, or a sentence. The difference was rarely marked on the menu. And so the image remains. A long table, a waiting crowd, the sound of a single drumbeat echoing against stone. Somewhere beyond the light, snow is falling. The hall is warm, the wine is poured, and the platter is being carried forward. It is a feast, or it is not.